Brian Selznick, you adapted your book Wonderstruck into a film with Todd Haynes. Talk a little bit about making the transition into screenwriting. I mean, when was it evident that you were going to be writing the screenplay for this film?
It's pretty early on, I think. I've been making books for a long time. I really think of myself very deeply as a bookmaker, and I never thought about writing a screenplay before. But I had the extremely exciting opportunity of watching my book, The Invention of Hugo Cabret, get made into the movie Hugo, and I met John Logan, who wrote the screenplay for Hugo, and I saw what he did to make that work as a movie. And I saw what he cut, what he changed, what he added, but still, it's one of the most faithful adaptations of a book to a film that I've ever seen, and I learned so much from watching what he did and how that movie was made, that when Sandy Powell, the costume designer for Hugo, she read the book of Wonderstruck and said that it should be a movie for Todd Haynes, and the idea that I should write the screenplay came up. And I was thrilled by the idea, but I really didn't know anything about writing screenplays at all. And so John Logan said he would take me under his wing, and I sort of got a master class in writing screenplays from John. And he, said he would give me notes and he would sort of help me along. But he said, just like make this the way you want it to be. Like, don't let anybody else tell you to change things. It's a unusual structure. It's an unusual story. Just write it the way you want to write it before you show it to anybody else, before you show it to any potential directors, any potential producers. Just make it yourself. And it was really John's confidence and Sandy's confidence in me that really made me begin to feel like, maybe I could do this. And I think visually anyway, like and movies have always been a big influence on my books. So so what's happening in the drawings in my books very often comes out of the language of cinema, but I'm translating it into the physical, object of a book that opens and the pages turn and the interaction between the words and the pictures. But thinking about what, someone like Alfred Hitchcock or Francois Truffaut or René Clair, the way they use the camera to tell the story has always had a big influence on my drawing. So in a way, it was sort of a natural switch to then think about how to take this book and these ideas and make them into something that feels like it was really meant to be a film.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the visual storytelling of it, and one of the interesting things about this movie is how little dialogue there is in it.
Yeah.
I mean, especially one half of the film. So, as screenwriters, you often rely upon dialogue to sort of inform characters. So working without that, can you talk about how you on the page were able to express the characters?
Yeah. No, I mean, one of the things that Todd Haynes talks about is how movies in so many ways really hit their highest heights during the silent movie era. And cinema really is a visual art form. And that we've just been trying to catch up with what the great silent movies were doing ever since sound was introduced, because dialogue so often can be a crutch. And of course, great dialogue is fantastic. Like, it's wonderful to hear people say things to each other that is gripping and moving and realistic in some way, or heightened in some way that can move you. But we shouldn't forget that what movies can do visually and how much information can be gotten across with what we're seeing. And so, because the story is about two deaf kids, I honestly didn't even realize how little dialogue there was, because I was very caught up in just getting across the idea of what everyone's doing and trying to figure out what that looks like and how to write that down. Because in the original book, the story of Rose in 1927, this deaf girl, is told entirely in drawings. And so it's sort of like I had accidentally done a storyboard of this entire half of the movie. And then Ben's story is told entirely in written language. And so, that's something that can only happen in a book. There's no cinematic equivalent of the interaction between words and pictures the way that I had that in the original book. Because the language in Ben's story puts us inside his head, and the only cinematic equivalent to that is like a voiceover, but we still have to be looking at something while we're hearing the voiceover. So in a book, it's like all you get is the voiceover, and again, there's no cinematic equivalent to that. So when I realized that I could tell her story, Rosa's story in 1927, like a black and white silent film, and we'd think it was silent because it's 1927, the last year before talkies were brought in, but actually it's silent because the main character is deaf and we're experiencing her story in a way that parallels her life. And then Ben's story could be told like a movie in the 70s. And I always imagined it like Robert Altman's McCabe and Mrs. Miller moving into Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets for kids. And then those two languages could interact. So that's actually written into the screenplay. And so I was thinking about the specific shots. I was thinking about the movement of the camera. John Logan, when he was giving me notes, encouraged me to not ever talk about the camera, like to just talk about the feeling and the movement, and to say, instead of saying things like the camera goes down the street, say something like we float down the street, we move down the street, something that could inspire the director to figure out what they want to do with the camera itself. So basically, so much of the screenplay is describing action. It's describing what the people are doing and making sure that what they're doing allows us to understand what they're feeling. And it wasn't until I saw a first cut of the movie, after we spent almost 2 months filming it, after I had watched everything being built and all the things coming together, that I sat and realized that in the film, for over an hour in the middle of the movie, there is no spoken dialogue. And like you mentioned, half the movie, and we talked about, half the movie is silent. So within the silent movie, there are characters talking to each other, and we can see their lips moving, but we don't know what they're saying. But I still had to write everything that they're saying so that when the director said, cut, do this again, they were able to go back and do the same thing again. So I wrote a huge amount of dialogue, some of which I think hearing people will be able to lip read. When a character says, "You are deaf," to another character, we'll be able to understand what she means. But the more important thing, in this situation, more important than what they're actually saying during a fight, is that we are aware that there's a fight happening. So that's the thing that's important. Now these two characters are angry with each other. Now this character is sad. Now this character is frustrated. And it was a matter of figuring out how to get that across with what, and again, like I wrote all the dialogue. There's a scene where a girl in 1927 goes to see an actress rehearsing a play. And the play, which is rehearsing in 1927, is set in the 18th century. So they're wearing the 1920s versions of 18th century costumes. And I wrote an entire 18th century play so that the actors would know what they were doing in that scene, even though when we watch it, we have no idea what the actors are actually saying on stage. So there was a lot that went into it dialogue-wise that I was aware wasn't going to be heard, but what needed to be there to get across the emotions that were more important, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And I mean, it really, I mean, thinking about the movie now, with you having explained that, I mean, you really do see the ways in which the visual storytelling of it is able to help put you into the perspective of the characters, I mean, because they would be saying things in real life, but she wouldn't be hearing them, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And in the movie, in the 1927 section, the character goes to see a silent movie. So in the silent movie, there's intertitles the way there would have been in the silent movies in the 1927 section. And even though we were filming her entire story like a silent movie, I didn't want to have intertitles in her part because I wanted it to be closer to real life. And of course, in real life, we don't actually have intertitles with what people are saying. So that we have the visual aspect of the silence without the use of the intertitles.
How closely did you adhere to your own book in the script?
I wrote a very faithful adaptation of my book. So character-wise, narratively, the arc is very, very similar to what I wrote in the original book. But one of the things that John Logan continuously encouraged me to do as I was writing the screenplay was to make everything more concise. So, he said in the book, Ben is in the museum for a week with Jamie. And he said, make it happen over a single night. And in the book, Ben has 3 clues as to who his father might be. And John said, pick one. And his first note to me was, cut the first 50 pages of your screenplay in half. And he meant it literally. Like, he literally, like, it wasn't until I got it down to 25 pages, the first 50, that he let me stop. Like, even when I had 2 pages to go and I thought I was done. I thought that was really close. Like, no, you've got 2 more pages to go. And so really the screenplay, the experience of that was very much about figuring out how to tell something, which in the book was a little bit more sprawling, a little bit more, I was able to move around things in a certain way. We were able to go into Ben's head and spend time with his thoughts, and let things unfold over over a much longer period of time, because you can do that in a book. And one of the things I saw with Hugo, and one of the things that John was encouraging me to do, was to remember that in a movie, you sit down when the lights go down and the projector comes on and you go, and of course movies can take their time, and there's different, I love the way cinema plays with time and the way different directors use time. And of course, if you watch a Tarkovsky film where time feels like it's almost stopped, and you have, it can be a sort of a transporting experience, as opposed to like The Wolf of Wall Street, which is on the poster behind you, where the whole time you feel like you're on an adrenaline rush, plowing through this person's life and the world that he's in. How time is used is really fascinating to me on screen. And so John was really great at encouraging me to remember what time can do in the cinema, and making sure that I focus on that, on the power of that ride.
And working with Todd Haynes, what was that collaboration like?
I mean, I have been a fan of Todd since Poison came out in 1991, and I have seen every one of his movies, and they're all incredible. Like, he's one of those rare directors who's deeply academic. Like, he comes out of the academic world. He's able to talk intellectually about what he's doing, about what his films are about. Yet he's also incredibly emotional. He's an incredible visual artist, and he has political things to say, very strong political points of view. And all of these things come together in different ways in each of his films. And so the fact that I had the opportunity to sit down with Todd Haynes and talk to him about my story and what he saw in it was incredible. And so once I had a workable screenplay, Sandy Powell gave it to Todd. Todd read it, said yes, and he came to Brooklyn, where I live, and we sat in a cafe all day, and we went through the screenplay page by page and looked at every single moment and how he envisioned it, how he saw it, how he saw the bigger set pieces, the bigger conception of the whole thing. But he embraced it all right away. So it was very clear that there were no big changes that he wanted to make in the screenplay. There were visual details he wanted to stitch in. There were a few little moments between characters that he wanted to talk to me about. But overall, the vision of what was there on the page is what he wanted to bring to life. But it was amazing because I work pretty instinctively. And so hearing Todd talk intellectually about what was on the page, which came, of course, out of my book, there were a lot of times where I felt like, oh, I think I'm learning something about my own story that I never really knew before. And right away he talked about how everything in the 20s, when he's filming it, everything that he sees, the 20s is all about the city rising up, and everything about the 70s is about the city falling down. And now when you watch the movie, when Rose enters New York, all of those shots are looking up, and the buildings, the magnificent strong buildings in the Wall Street areas you're walking through, and the crowds wearing furs and all these beautiful outfits. Everything is rich and clean and beautiful and awe-inspiring. And of course, the 70s are the opposite of all of that, and everything is about looking down at the garbage and the rawness of everything, which I think Sandy Powell with the costumes and Mark Friedberg with the production design and Ed Lockman with the cinematography made something that feels like it was actually shot in the 70s. That grittiness is real, and so getting to see that through Todd's eyes, and how everybody collaborated to bring to life what Todd saw was one of the most exciting parts of this whole experience.
It's also interesting because, as was also the case with Hugo and Martin Scorsese, your work allows these filmmakers to explore new kinds of stories that we wouldn't typically associate with them. To make you think a little bit about your own work, what do you think it is about these children's stories that you write that attract these filmmakers? Is it something visually that they see? Is it something emotional? What do you think that is?
When I got when I first got the phone call that Scorsese wanted to make a movie out of my book, I was as shocked and as floored as you could imagine anybody could be. And my first thought was like, oh my, like Martin Scorsese read my book, and and then you think like, oh my God, this is going to be so great to tell my mother. Like Martin Scorsese read my book. And the chance of him ever actually making a movie out of it, we all are aware that it's hard to make a movie out of anything. Like the fact that, even if there's interest, it's not always necessarily going to happen. But there was such a thrill that Scorsese read the book. And of course, it's a shock when the name first comes up. But then when I stopped and thought about it and thought about the little that I knew about Martin Scorsese, suddenly everything began to make sense in terms of who Scorsese is, what his childhood was like, what his relationship to film is. And after the movie came out, someone said it was Martin Scorsese's imaginary autobiography, because it turned out every one of the characters in some way had a relationship to Martin Scorsese. So, Scorsese talked about being a young boy who was very ill. He had asthma. I had asthma when I was a kid. He talks about being in his house, looking out his window at the Little Italy outside, which of course is the opening shot of Goodfellas, where Henry Hill is a young man, a young boy looking out the window at the gangsters he dreams of being, which of course was my opening shot of Hugo, where Hugo's looking out of the clock at the world below him. But I can very clearly state I was not thinking of Martin Scorsese when I wrote the book, but that was there for him. And then Scorsese is a film scholar, the way my character Renee Tabard in the story is a film scholar. And Martin Scorsese rediscovered a lost director, Michael Powell, who did The Red Shoes, who had fallen into obscurity, the way that Hugo rediscovers George Méliès. And of course, Scorsese is a director the way George Méliès is. So he was able to see all of these pieces of himself in this story. So it was a personal, very personal thing for him. And of course, he had a 12-year-old daughter at the time. And I think his wife was especially excited about the idea that maybe he could make a movie that his daughter could actually see. and I think there's parallels with that for Todd, where Todd, when you look at the movies that Todd has made, and you look at the way people are outsiders in his films, the queer characters that he's written about, the queer themes that he's written about, what it means to be inside a culture and outside a culture simultaneously, what it means to try to be rejected by the world. Look at Safe and look at Poison and look at these stories that are about people who are, they at the time they came out of the AIDS crisis, and they came out of this desire to look at how queer people were being, rejected and put away, and how you find your way back into the culture and back into the world. And here you've got this parallel story with these deaf children who are trying to find their way in the world, and this friendship between these two boys, which is that kind of intense love that you can have, that pre-sexual connection that, that if we're lucky, we've had that kind of friendship when we were kids, and we remember that the strength of that, and it's a kind of love. And I think Todd was able to see the connections in these characters and these children. And of course, he's had children in his stories before, you know, even in like Dottie Gets Spanked, you know, one of his early films. And, you know, and of course, in I'm Not There, you know, he's had children in them, and in Mildred Pierce, but they're generally, of course, within stories that children probably should not see. and so the idea that all of those themes were present in a story that is accessible for kids, I think meant a lot to him. And, you know, and of course, you know, we even have something in the movie that parallels Superstar, his, you know, very early film that he was famous for, telling the story of Karen Carpenter with Barbie dolls. Mm-hmm. And so there's a section in Wonderstruck that's told in miniature that brought him back to that connection as well. And so, you know, I think of this movie not as a children's movie that Todd Haynes made. I think of it as a Todd Haynes movie that's accessible to kids, and the first one that's accessible to kids. But it's a fully realized, complex, beautiful Todd Haynes movie. And yeah, and I feel great pride and honor that both Martin Scorsese and Todd Haynes, two of our greatest living filmmakers, saw something in a story I made up at my desk by myself that took 3 years and was a really difficult struggle, that they saw something in those stories that they wanted to then spend years of their own lives bringing to life.
Well, congratulations on the movie, and thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really great to talk to you.
Same here. Have a good one.
All right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.